Welcome to episode 233 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism exposes and analyzes the threat we face, promotes efforts to defend people targeted by the fascists, and most essentially, challenge, mobilize, and inspire the non-fascist majority of people living in the United States to engage in determined, defiant collective action to defeat Trump MAGA fascism. I want to thank everyone who tuned in to our live episode earlier this week. Thanks to our patrons, our sustainers who make the show possible. A big thank you to everyone who rates and reviews the show on Apple Podcasts or their listening platform of choice. They boost the show so much. So please, after you listen to today's episode, give a review, give a rating, and help build this audience. Thanks to all who share the show, everyone who buys our merch to support and spread this podcast. You can see the show notes to get yours. Today, we're running an interview with Jessica Pishko, lawyer, journalist, and author of The Highest Law in the Land: How the Unchecked Power of Sheriffs Threatens Democracy. And seriously, I cannot recommend Jessica's book highly enough. Go out and read it. We have a widely unexamined force in our society. Law enforcement politicians given wide-ranging power over communities, near absolute control over county jails, and extraordinary leeway to enforce their very own versions of quote-unquote, the law. These sheriffs are elected through a system that makes the Electoral College look downright egalitarian, with massive overrepresentation of fascists and other far-right figures. And they are perfectly positioned to turn the wildest dreams of the MAGA fascist leadership into reality on the ground, particularly in regards to mass deportations, but by no means limited to that. This must and can be challenged locally as we take on this program nationwide. So stay tuned for that interview later in the show. But first, let's talk directly about the moment we're in right now. Today is January 19th, 2025. We're just hours away from Trump's inauguration, hours away from fascists having unprecedented levels of power in the most powerful and dangerous country in the world. Despite the continuing disbelief, despite the widespread self-delusion that it can't and won't be that bad, despite the suffocating silence of millions of people living in the belly of the beast, with citizens of the empire insisting to themselves and the world they are utterly powerless. The effective complicity of the good Americans is rolling out the red carpet for Trump's return to power. For our part, we must make clear that their promise for unprecedented mass deportations, for patriarchal and white supremacist theocratic rule, for accelerating the destruction of the planet's ability to sustain human life, and so much more, these promises are deadly serious. While we cannot tell the future, the people of this country must quickly prepare themselves to be shocked and awed by the speed and impact of the fascist program over the next few days, not just years, days. The time people have taken for processing it all, for tuning it out, for waiting and seeing, that's over. And when that becomes clearly unsustainable, we cannot let people look for some other self-justification for inaction. It must be replaced by rage, by refusal. It's time for a new kind of acceptance, not acceptance of the inevitability of fascism, not some therapeutic but delusional acceptance of our supposed powerlessness, not acceptance of losing our most basic sense of morality. No, we need to accept, to confront the reality that MAGA fascism is an existential threat to humanity, that no one is coming to save us, and that we can wrench a radically different future out of this nightmare. This week, we held a live virtual forum, Offense and Defense, How to Defeat Trump MAGA Fascism and Defend Those Under Attack, with Coco Das, Ensign Sarah Taylor. Faisal Al-Jabri was scheduled to participate but fell ill, and we plan to have him on again soon. The full event can be watched on our YouTube channel. And right now, we want to highlight some particularly relevant comments here.
This is a full-bore fascist regime who have been building in their program. They have Project 2025 raring to go. They have 4 years since the January 6th attempted coup, where they purged the Republican Party of anybody who stood against them. They've captured the Supreme Court this time. Trump is coming in with a stripped-down, fully fascist party, all three branches of government, an unleashed, rabid social base, and he means to carry through exactly what he has promised. And this is a nightmare for humanity. But it's coming out of a country and it's coming out of a system that has had white supremacy, male supremacy, American domination and imperialist expansionism and military aggression and exploitation built into its foundations. And so this is not an aberration, but it is a leap and it is extreme, and it really needs to be confronted for what it is, and it needs to be massively opposed, and it needs to be defeated through mass, nonviolent, massive struggle of millions and millions standing up and refusing to accept it. And then it's very important that we go to the root of it. The system that gave rise to this fascism, a system which is thoroughly outmoded, completely illegitimate. People are saying, well, Trump was elected this time, he won the popular vote, therefore he's legitimate. No, if your system can, through its own mechanisms, its normal channels, its legal parameters, elect and put in power a full-out fascist, that doesn't tell you he's legitimate. That tells you the system is illegitimate. On the illegitimacy, it is true that Trump, he was prepared to steal the election. Everybody knows, okay? He made clear if he didn't win, it was cheating, it was no good. He never agreed to accept the election results no matter what. This man wanted to come back to power through whatever means, okay? He did, though, come to power through the quote-unquote legitimate channels of the elections in this country. So does that make him legitimate? I would like to hear anybody make the argument that Hitler should have been accepted in Nazi Germany because he too came to power through legitimate means. He didn't come to power through a coup, and neither did Trump this time around. You know, he didn't come to power through breaking the rules, but does that mean that you accept it? Does anybody want to make the argument that they should have accepted Hitler? And no, they're not the exact same, but actually they are worth comparing. And Donald Trump, as opposed to Hitler, is in charge of the most powerful military and dominant force in the entire planet and in human history. And to just take one example of that, you look at just the absolutely horrific genocide that has been unending, grinding in Gaza, fueled, funded, backed, defended by Biden and Harris and the entire ruling class of this country. It's difficult to imagine how that could be a greater horror. You know, you see it live streamed every day. Children dying of hypothermia, on top of the starvation, on top of the bombs, on top of the deprivation, on top of the hospitals being targeted, on top of snipers being found in the bodies of 2-year-olds. Repeatedly, okay, children. Okay, this is what American doctors and international doctors see over and over again. And what does Trump say? He says, if there's not a hostage release before I come in, you're going to see hell on a whole nother level. This is a man who's putting in Christian fascist crusaders, people who say, Mike Huckabee, there is no such thing as a Palestinian. You know, people who literally are on a mission from God, don't think women should have the right to divorce. Forget about abortion. Not divorce, okay? I mean, these are like real serious threat to people around the world and to people in this country. And so it should not be accepted. You know, it's completely illegitimate no matter how it came to power. And it does pose that the mechanisms, the system, the underlying dynamics and nature of the system that would let somebody like this come to power through its normal channels, that's what's illegitimate. As for how we defeat this and stop it, first of all, you have to refuse to accept it. Step out and say no. Through our actions, through the truth that we tell, but also through our actions, our courage, our boldness, our disruptive actions, we need to call forward and rally people's righteous anger at this and their determination not to take it.
One way that's not going to stop it is if we continue to conciliate and accept this culture of passivity, collaboration, conciliation, thinking that we're going to be able to convince Trump supporters one by one by, being nice people to change, maybe then we'll win the next election. That's completely delusional. And we really need to have society erupt in mass defiance, mass refusal at every level, in every corner of society, in every city and town. Getting the slogan out, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. I think that's step one. And putting all of our sort of creative and moral energy into changing the terms on which people are thinking about this. Tens of millions of people absolutely hate this. And it is those tens of millions who can clog up and jam up the channels and the pipes to such an extent that Trump cannot govern. There are examples all over the world of that happening. We're not calling for any acts of revenge or anything. You really have to stand up to it in every way possible. Nonviolent mass protest, mass refusal. Relying on the Democrats is a big part of what's gotten us here. The norms have been torn up. And it is really important to, protest against any outrage that comes out. But at the same time, this is something that I think characterized the kind of protest in the first term was there would be an attack. For example, the family separation came down. And it was very good that people got out and they protested, or when the Muslim ban was announced and people went to the airports and they protested. But at the same time, I think we have to recognize that fascism is an exercise in blatant dictatorship, and they are able to absorb these separate acts of opposition. And you do have to actually take on the fascism as a whole and have a movement that goes up against the fascism.
I think you go on the offensive politically because it's completely illegitimate and unacceptable. Enslaving women to forced motherhood is unacceptable. It's a horror. Your body, my choice. These hyena, rabid, women-hating bros who are just fully unleashed. This is illegitimate. You go on the offensive because it's garbage. It's bad. It's bullshit. It's ugly. It's horrific. You can't stomach it. It's no good. The same with the treating immigrants like they're not human beings. They're parents and children go to school and they come home and their parents are missing. Do you know the terror of that? I mean, people who their homelands have been bombed by U.S. imperialism. They've been set on fire by the ravages of climate change, or undergone hurricanes or droughts so that their land is not arable anymore because of climate change. The number one culprit in the world is the U.S. and the U.S. military driving this destruction. Not the only, but the number one. There's nothing legitimate about this. These people are driven from their homelands. They come into this country. They're forced to live in the shadows. They do the worst, most dangerous jobs. They're treated like animals with no rights. And then they're rounded up and deported. There's nothing legitimate about it. And so you go politically on the offense against the whole of it because there's right and wrong. Because there's what kind of world and what kind of future do you want and what kind of human being are you going to be? So this is why I'm saying it's not a calculation. You start and say, ooh, well, how do we, the triangulating like the Democratic Party, what's going to sell, what's going to maneuver, well, how are we going to market this? No, you start with what's right and wrong and what kind of future do you want and what kind of human being do you want to be? And then you fight for that. You go politically on the offensive because we're right and because what we're fighting for. The slogan is very powerful. In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. That's an offensive slogan with tremendous meaning that actually takes the lives and the futures of 8 billion people on this planet and takes them into your hands and into your hearts. And you say, no, we're not letting you do this to the masses of people, into humanity, into the future. And you fight against that. In the name of humanity, you find your strength in that, and you give other people strength by standing on that and setting a standard and insisting on it and saying anything else, what Coco was saying, conciliating, hiding, going for self, that's bullshit. That's complicity. That's good German behavior. That's what they did in Nazi Germany, and we do not look kindly on that for good reason. You have to stand up, and yes, it's going to require courage. It's going to require sacrifice. It's going to require a lot of struggle, but there's something bigger than yourself. And that's what makes life worth living. That's what gives life meaning. You're doing it for something bigger than yourself, and it's possible to defeat this. So you step out there in the name of humanity. And we refuse to accept a fascist America because you confront the truth of what this is. If you hide from it, it doesn't change it. It will come for you. Whether you want to confront it or not, it will come for humanity, whether you want to confront it or not. So you have to name it, you have to call it out, you have to stand against it. And through doing that, yes, through speaking, but also through acting, you set a standard and you plant a pole and you provide an anchor for others to step forward. That's how every social movement has begun. You have to get out there. You have to get out there when nobody else will. There are tens of millions who hate this. There are tens of millions who could become complicit. There's tens of millions who could go along, or there are tens of millions who could be rallied to stand up. And what we do is going to be decisive in influencing that. Yes, other things will influence it too, but this is where we have cards to play. We have to step out there and call it out offensively. At the same time, there's got to be defense of people who are under attack. We need to be putting our bodies between the attacks by the illegitimate forces of the fascist state or from fascist thugs and defending the rights and the lives of the people, saying, no, you can't get away with this. That's how you create a fighting people. You defend the rights and the lives of the people, but you're overall going on offense against the entirety of it. Coco's right. You have to call out the fascism, and you have to call it out as a whole and say, no, we refuse to accept this. Because if all you do is defense, the entire juggernaut is bulldozing forward, and you're defending on shrinking ground, and you're doing rear guard, doomed to eventually be consumed actions. But in the context of going offensively against the whole of it, you have to defend people and build up that strength and make every single incident a two-sided incident. You have to attract those who are ready to stand up first. And then, yes, for other people, it'll circulate in their mind and they'll feel uncomfortable and they'll think about it. And then they'll go back and forth. But they'll start to relate to something different. And the fact is, it is fascism. So you have to get people confronting that. And if it makes them uncomfortable at first, that's fine. Better they be uncomfortable on the road to understanding what they need to know and relating to it and standing up around it than comfortable going along with the nightmare and letting the nightmare consume humanity. The problem is right now we need to get people out of their comfort zone. So we have to stand against the grain and go out there and call them forward.
You can watch the whole event on our YouTube channel under Lives. See the link in the show notes. We salute all those who took to the streets this weekend and will protest the inauguration tomorrow. Now truly is the time to unite, to defeat Trump MAGA fascism. No accommodation, no conciliation. Time for relentless collective action. A special cheers to all those finding the ways to manifest the imperative. In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist USA. Tag us in your photos and videos so that we can share it and inspire others. It is becoming likely that in addition to the suite of threatened day one executive orders, the Laken Riley Act is poised to be the first piece of legislation that Congress will deliver for Trump to sign into law. We went into detail on this act in the last mini episode, and people should go back and listen and spread that. But one thing needs to be shouted from the rooftops. This is a straight up Klan bill, and anyone signing it, Republican or Democrat, is effectively donning their pointy robes. The heart of this bill writes into law the central concept of the decades of lynching terror that effectively issued a license to any white man to murder Black individuals, families, and even destroy whole Black communities with absolute impunity. To put it bluntly, in reality, the people who murder and abuse young American white women are most often American white men by an astronomical margin. But this bill presents an alternate reality where the only way to maintain the virtue and value the lives of white women is to purge our society of quote-unquote illegals, effectively calling open season on immigrants, those suspected to be immigrants, and people of color generally. This cannot stand. The Democratic Party has made clear that they won't stop this. In fact, many are signing on. This is no longer the mansion and cinema narrative that helped the Democratic Party leadership wash their hands of the very basic legislation decent people voted them in to enact. As today's guest, Jessica Pishko, wrote recently, yesterday, quote, far from resisting, Democrats seem determined to facilitate, quote unquote, mass deportation. And while the propaganda may be splashier than the results, we should all be concerned about condemning more people to banishment and punishment, end quote. It is clearer than ever that the only force that can stand up and stop this is the millions who are appalled by this, the millions who are disgusted by this. No proxies, no real politic, simply people taking collective, undiluted action, demanding the most basic rights of the most vulnerable among us. With that, here's our interview with Jessica. Today, we're taking a look at one of the most overlooked but crucial aspects of the political landscape in the United States, the role of sheriffs in advancing Trump MAGA fascism. Our guest is Jessica Pishko, author of the groundbreaking book, The Highest Flaw in the Land, How the Unchecked Power of Sheriffs Threatens Democracy. Jessica is an independent journalist and lawyer who has been writing about the criminal legal system for over a decade with a focus on the political power of law enforcement officials. In more recent years, she has focused on American sheriffs and their role, past and present, in perpetuating mass incarceration and white supremacy, examining how sheriffs present a growing threat to democratic rights in the United States. Jessica's work, I feel, sheds a light on how sheriffs have become truly pivotal, powerful players in the MAGA movement. From defying federal authority to supporting voter suppression, sheriffs are central to attacks on democratic norms and rights in the U.S. At the time you're listening, we are a day away from Trump's inauguration, and sheriffs are positioning themselves as key enforcers of his most draconian policies, particularly his plans for mass deportations. In this conversation, we'll explore how sheriffs have not only embraced Trump's MAGA agenda, but are actively shaping its implementation on the ground. What are the implications for migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, and those suspected of being in any of those groups? What does it mean for democracy when these largely unaccountable figures hold the power to determine fates of communities? And how do we resist their growing influence in a time of rising fascism? Welcome, Jessica. Thank you so much for joining us.
That's so good to be here.
I wanted to start with a personal question. How did you decide that sheriffs were what you wanted to shine the spotlight on, given all that there is? We were talking before the show where I was like reading the book, and there were chapter after chapter where I was like, I never thought about this at all. I never knew this. It was really informative and, yes, frightening to read. But I was wondering, like, how did you come across this topic and realize this deserves the attention?
It's a really fair question because honestly, when I initially started working on and thinking about sheriffs, there were quite a number of people who told me that it was probably not like worthwhile, that it was mostly a waste of time. Maybe a little bit of spite in some of this. That's just to say, like, many people were very dubious about it. So when I first started, it came to my attention before Trump when I was doing criminal system reporting, and in California, as a way to reduce the prison system, what the state did was send a lot of people from the state prison back to jails. And those jails were all controlled by elected county sheriffs. And what I found was that while the county sheriffs were receiving funding from the state, so it was essentially they received funding in order to take more people to hold in the jail, I realized that different sheriffs were doing wildly different things. They had very different programs. They had very different ideas of who was being held and why and how they would be treated. And I thought that it was particularly interesting because it was honestly just not something I had spent that much time thinking about. I was very interested in the idea of elected officials like district attorneys, like sheriffs, like judges. And so I thought, well, this seems like an area where the individual who's elected as sheriff seems to matter a lot. They get to make a lot of decisions. And as I worked on it, I became even more interested because sheriffs in particular have a sort of unusual role. And a lot of that role is based in history, which we could kind of go back and talk about, but kind of by an accident of history, right? They're a vestige of sort of an older United States, kind of older imperialist country. And they today do both policing. So they do street policing, traffic stops, investigate crimes in most places, and they run jails. And as a result, I think they've been able to build quite a lot of influence because as the criminal legal system has grown, and actually even in fact as states have implemented reform, what a lot of that has done is given sheriffs more power locally. So in a sense, the office has grown, even while I think most people would say that a lot has been done to try to reduce mass incarceration. We may be in a little bit of a retrenchment, but I think the idea that mass incarceration is a problem is an older issue. But I think what's less examined is how does that trickle down to what happens on the local level?
Thanks for that. I wanted to talk a little bit more about that outsized role that you mentioned, that sheriffs play an outsized role in some of the worst elements of American history, so-called manifest destiny and the genocide of Native peoples, Jim Crow, convict leasing, etc. The position also harkens back to a sense of unrestrained patriarchy, I think as you describe it, quote unquote, fixtures in the American mythology of masculine independence. What about this position has placed them front and center in these historic horrors? And how do you see that legacy persisting today?
Probably a lot of listeners to this podcast have heard about police being a vestige of slave catchers. And this is sort of a narrative that I think has become more acknowledged and common. When I looked at sheriffs, though, what I saw was, interestingly, a direct connection to the United States as a colonial empire, really. That the role of the sheriff before kind of the 1800s was just not particularly important. Now, I will say that sheriffs themselves trace this role back to Anglo-Saxon Britain. They argue that it was brought kind of across the seas and was installed as sort of like in its kind of Anglo-Saxon glory, which I think now in and of itself, we can sort of feel like why this is an office that is already lending itself to white supremacy. It's an Anglo-Saxon glory kind of office. But, you know, the elected sheriff in the United States was different than it was in Britain. And it really didn't start to happen until around the 1820s and 30s when Andrew Jackson became president. Of course, Andrew Jackson, not only kind of a populist, but I think it's really interesting to think about that as we look at the inauguration of Trump, which probably will happen. He was a soldier, a farmer. He kind of brought this idea that in order to make the United States different and special, we ought to have more elected officials. And so it was really important to Andrew Jackson that kind of the yeoman farmer type, of course white, of course male, but people who were not necessarily landowners, expanding the franchise to this group of people that, you know, what we would call today the white working class man in his day. And the other thing, of course, about Andrew Jackson is that he was really important in building the United States as empire, right? He played a really important role in the removal of native tribes and genocide of Native Americans and encouraging people, white settlers, to move west and colonize the continent. And one of the things that I think also gets a little bit overlooked at that time is just how much war there was in this era. The wars against Native Americans, and this counts myself as well, that I didn't really process how much war there was, that in the process of removing people from their lands, in committing acts of genocide, that there was substantial fighting on both sides, and that required numbers of soldiers. Then there was the Spanish-American War, and then there was westward expansion, which again involved fighting people who were Mexican, who were already living on what was becoming the United States. And as a result, the culture of, I think, the West became rather warlike. At the time, there was many decommissioned militaries. And so when you look at kind of the early history of sheriffs, particularly the West, what you actually see is a lot of men who were soldiers and whose idea of what policing looked like was more like a militia. The threats were external. So it was to the extent that the people they wanted to protect were white settlers, and the threats to those white settlers were Native Americans, were Mexicans, were kind of what we would say threats from abroad. And I think that was a really important thought that helped me to think about how sheriffs fit into the policing universe. And it also helps to explain why sheriffs are, as we say, a little bit different and why they have consolidated power in a different way.
And I think there is this way in which they are the perfect avatar for Trumpism. The I am the law mentality. I can do what I can do, you can't. If the law doesn't suit me, I'll change it, or I will create something different that only applies to me. And I think that that is very much in line with my understanding of the office of the sheriffs and my understanding of Trump. And I think that there's a lot of commonality there. And I think when it comes to the white supremacy, the misogyny, the male supremacy, the vicious xenophobia that characterizes so much of that movement. They are the avatar of all of that too. It's a very dangerous alignment that too many people aren't aware of in terms of the influence that that can have, both the influence on those local communities that they have been a part of their whole lives, that look to them, whether we want them to be looked at as leaders or not, they are. And by those in power, they're looked to as an authority of representing their people as somebody in elected office. So I think that that compounds the danger.
When you think about the role of sheriff in a lot of counties, just to also sort of put a note on this, that we don't think a lot about counties because counties don't feel very important anymore, but there's just over 3,000 counties. And if you look at county election results, what you see is something like 85% of counties voted for Trump. Now, of course, I want to be clear that this is not 85% of people. It's very far from 85% of people. But what it does reflect is that if you were to look at the country on a land level, it's a little bit like the Electoral College. Because every county gets a sheriff, whether you have 10 million people or 200 people, it can start to look like a lot of sheriffs are behind you. So it looks like a lot of sheriffs are aligning with Trump, despite the fact that these sheriffs are not representing a majority of the population. It creates a disproportionate appearance, which I think is very useful when sheriffs are lobbying the state or when they're lobbying the federal government. And it is true. I think it really reflects this patriarchy, this sort of dismissal of expertise, this real misogyny, which I do think over the course of reporting the book got stronger. I actually think that that was something I saw increase, whereas I thought it would perhaps decrease. I think I saw it get worse. And I was a bit surprised myself when I was encountering it. So I think it is interesting to think about this, that they see their way of life departing. And if you ask them, most of them are also Christian. There are very few non-Christian sheriffs. And that's true. They think about themselves as they go to church with the people in their community. They see them at the grocery store. They see them at the high school football game. This sort of what they would say is all American, feel good, traditional values. And again, I would say, of course, that it's not reflective of the population of the United States, to be clear, but they feel like that's the thing that they are potentially losing, is that style of policing, and it's a style of policing. And of course, if that's something that's disappearing, that also means that style of policing is disappearing, which also means that that power they have and the political power and influence they have might also disappear, which I think makes it extra alarming for many of these sheriffs.
Even though in reality, their power is increasing instead of decreasing, where they're seen as, you have the Claremont Institute and all these other seen as legitimate think tanks or whatnot, bolstering them. Not all of these groups, I don't think, but majority of the groups associated with Project 2025 have all identified the unique role of sheriffs. I think Claremont puts it best in terms of their defense of civilization, their pivotal role in defense of civilization. I think they just put it best. By that, I mean putting it in the most problematic way ever.
That's exactly right. If you think about that as empire, it's the creation of the United States empire.
Yeah, so I thought it was way too on the nose, but yeah. One theme that we see across almost every topic that we cover, contrary to the notion of democratic institutions being guardrails against fascism, the normal, quote unquote, democratic functioning of this country has created and developed programs, norms, organizations, and legal constructs seemingly optimized in ways that can enable such a takeover. You mentioned the Electoral College, for example. The role of sheriffs in society is one place that we feel this is apparent. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what changes for sheriffs with Trump in office and how both are they positioned to act and how can he activate them?
Sheriffs are a perfect example of an office that is, again, populist. They are elected. So most people would think, oh, more elections are more democracy. But what we find is that electing sheriffs is not producing more democracy. Actually, sheriffs sheriffs serve much longer terms than appointed police chiefs. And there are various reasons for that. Like there's structural reasons why sheriffs are elected over and over, why their elections are lacking in competition. But I agree that over time, it has sort of eroded the office such that it's no longer what I would say is democratic, even though it is elected. So it is sort of this perfect example of populist fascism in a way. I think that one of the things about sheriffs that I do think Trump and MAGA movement generally appreciate is that, one, sheriffs are highly subject to politics. As politicians, they have the ability to make policies for their office without asking anyone, certainly something that Trump feels like he can also do. Two, they retain the power of law enforcement. So in this country, legitimate law enforcement has a certain amount of power. They have things like qualified immunity that protect them from lawsuits. They have the ability to arrest and jail and to use violence on people. They have an amount of inculpability that all law enforcement have, which I think is something that can't be overlooked, which enables, I think, their utility. And then because they have so much control over both their communities and many facets of the criminal legal system, they're able to weaponize things like jails, things like red flag orders, which are orders to remove firearms from people who might be dangerous, things like refusing to enforce gun control laws. They have this sort of role in lots of pieces, especially pieces that are really, really important to MAGA. So he can weaponize them, if you will, and give them directives that enable them to do his bidding. And it, of course, so happens the main things that Trump ran on was more law and order style policing and mass deportations. And those are two things where sheriffs are extremely involved. So it also happens to be that where the MAGA movement is focusing are also these things that they can use sheriffs to do.
Given that one of the big pillars of his program is this horrific mass deportation, mass detention mission to deport 11 million or more people is his goal. The sheriffs are very eager to participate, some of the first to extend their willingness to lend a hand. And the role of sheriffs in immigration, I don't think is understood by many people. And so I guess first, what role have sheriffs come to play in regards to immigration? And how does Homan and others in Trump land, how are they hoping to unleash sheriffs to implement this mass deportation?
Yeah, among local law enforcement, sheriffs are probably the most pivotal to immigration. And we did see this during Trump 1. One of the things that happened during Trump 1, to be honest, was sheriffs became in some ways more visible because we had some sheriffs running against the idea of cooperating with ICE. That was something that happened. I mean, I have very different thoughts about the strategies of Trump 2 that I think Tom Homan, who, of course, worked at DHS under Trump 1, so I think he has refined some of his ideas and has had time to think about how to do things a little bit differently. So just to put the role of sheriffs plainly, there's two main kinds of immigration enforcement. There's enforcement at the border, usually the U.S.-Mexico border is what you'll most commonly see. And a lot of that involves what is in essence like policing at the U.S.-Mexico border, usually done in conjunction with Customs and Border Patrol. And that's what you might expect. It's traffic stops, it's stopping people they think are driving immigrants from place to place. The general process is people might cross the border, someone picks them up, they get into some sort of vehicle, and then they drive to a bus station or wherever to go where they're going. Sheriffs, as law enforcement, particularly in rural areas, have a big role in assisting Border Patrol with things like traffic stops. So stopping cars and vehicles that they believe might be transporting immigrants. Because sheriffs have this sort of political role, they go on a lot of TV. I consider it really just anti-immigrant propaganda. They produce a lot of anti-immigrant propaganda with a lot of right-wing vloggers and video people and right? There's a whole universe of sort of anti-immigrant, quote unquote, news people that will film immigrants crossing the border, will film cars and trucks, will film these stops. So this is a whole system that I think is a very large part propaganda. And the second role that sheriffs have is usually called interior enforcement. And this is basically how do you locate immigrants who live in the United States who might be deportable? Well, the easiest way is usually if they are arrested and in jail. And this is something that's relatively more recent. This began to really take off during the 90s and the war on drugs. It's sort of a drug war type thing. The idea behind these various pieces of legislation that gave more power to sheriffs and local law enforcement to do immigration. Their idea was, well, what we want to do is get drug dealers, like bad guys. If we enable sheriffs to do more work to locate people who might be deportable, then that's easy because then the sheriffs already have them. They can just call ICE and say, hey, can you come pick this guy up? So it turns out when someone's in jail, you actually know where they are. You don't have to go looking for them. They're right there. And when you're in jail, you can't leave. So sheriffs can hold you until ICE comes and picks you up. Now, what that's resulted in is this sort of patchwork enforcement of ICE cooperation across the country. And this is the thing that I think is going to be a big part of the plan. One of the things that seems to be going on is the desire to portray many immigrants as criminals. And this is something that's very, very old, to argue the criminality of immigrants and to say, I don't like to frame people in terms of criminals and non-criminals, but to say we know there's very clear data, immigrants do not commit more crime. There's no linkage between immigration status and criminality. Nevertheless, it is easy to do propaganda that portrays immigrants as criminals. And that's something Trump has done very successfully, and lots of other law enforcement do too. Every single B-roll on Fox News. Sometimes the propaganda they use, they always show young men, in the parlance, military-age men. They usually have dark skin. They're crossing the border. They're sort of dirty because they've been walking through the desert. I always think they portray them as sort of hardened figures that we are supposed to see as like a desperados. They've come to this country ready. Now, want to say that this is like propaganda because in the first instance, they're usually reusing the same footage. In the second instance, yes, many people look unhappy when they are walking across the desert. This doesn't reflect anything unusual about these people at all. But we see right now that there is a very low appetite among Democrats to oppose this. And one of the symbols is this Laken Riley bill that is probably going to be passed in the legislature. That to me was really a sign that the big difference this time is that Tom Homan and Trump are going to argue that immigrants are causing crime and Democrats are not going to fight it. And that's going to be a really big difference. The Laken Riley Act, if people aren't as familiar, one of the things it does is just makes more people deportable. So in general, if an immigrant is arrested, they may check their immigration status, but there's sort of deportation priorities. So most of the time, ICE is looking for people who have committed fairly what we would call serious crimes, murder or rape or child abuse. Usually those people, if they are deportable, they will be put into deportation proceedings. But many people are arrested for lots of different things. And so they don't always worry about deporting everybody who gets arrested. Now, the Laken Riley Act really opens up the number of people potentially deportable. It includes people accused of things like shoplifting or larceny or theft or writing a bad check. This is a big deal because honestly, these are the types of crimes. And I will say, again, it's accused of crimes. So it's not like they're proven guilty, but these are the types of crimes that are common. I think that creates a lot more wiggle room for sheriffs who want to do more deportation. One, to target people. They can target immigrant communities and arrest more people on the basis of these looser priorities. And two, to argue that, well, also then we arrested these people, but now that we've arrested them, we've made them criminals. And so now we're going to deport them. So the process of it is between the far right propaganda and the arrest, it's really the process of making immigrants criminals and then using that as a good reason to argue in favor of their deportation.
I really appreciate that breakdown and lifting up kind of the role that they play, yes, absolutely, in detaining, connecting with ICE, the whole cooperation and facilitation from people being in their jails and holding them there until they are detained by ICE, but also the piece of popularizing the bigotry and pushing the narrative that there is this special, more horrific crime, quote unquote, migrant crime that must be stopped. It doesn't take like a deep dive in history to look and see experiences where that has happened, including in this country, and where that has led. When you paint a whole people as subhuman, what that normalizes and unleashes amongst a population is extremely dangerous. So I wanted to lift that up. I think that some people might think that there's like a hypocrisy in the sheriffs who are so focused on the local that here they are collaborating with a federal agency, but they're like some of the biggest players in immigration. I don't know if there was anything that you wanted more to talk about in terms of what impact the sheriffs can have on the ground in these communities. I know that there's already some defiance among sheriffs pledging in advance to go against governors or sanctuary ordinances or anything like that. I don't know if there was anything else that you wanted to lift up to make sure that people are aware of.
One of the things I think is really important in this time, as we talked a little bit about Trump's plans for mass deportation, there's a little bit of dissonance between what the stated project is and the propaganda of the project, and then kind of what the law is and what may or may not be feasible. I don't put anything off the table. Obviously, I'm just talking about what seems like it might happen, but I do think one of the things that sheriffs have been successful at is generating the appearance of criminality by arresting people, by going on TV and talking about people, by saying they're partnering with Trump, by presenting themselves as authorities in their community, right? Another sort of role. And then there's sort of the legal part, which is the actual arrest and the detention and the holding. One of the issues that many people have noted in the mass deportation scheme is that there are limits in terms of personnel, space, etc. For example, right now, ICE doesn't and cannot pick up everybody that might be deportable. It's just a fact. That's why they have priorities. So kind of scrambling the priorities, one of the things that what I think it's likely to do is create inconsistent results, which is what happened during Trump 1. And I do think what that does do is instill a lot of fear because the results are inconsistent. You can no longer say, oh, they're primarily focused on this category of people. It's like they're focused on all the people. So if you are unlucky or you have drive through this county, this person might target you. And while that is just racial profiling, I think unfortunately that is likely to happen and not likely to have a lot of stopgap. I mean, in terms of participating with the federal government, one of the arguments I kind of make in the book is that the quote unquote constitutional sheriff movement is sort of misportrayed as anti-government. I don't think it's anti-government. I mean, what it really is just a series of policy positions that are right-wing. Like, I just don't see any daylight. They oppose abortion. They oppose gun laws. They want more religion in government, more religion in public life. They oppose public schools in many cases. They want more states' rights and local control. And they are extremely xenophobic. They're very anti-immigrant. I mean, at this point, those policy points are just GOP policy points. You know, I think there was a time when one could portray the constitutional sheriff movement as somewhat libertarian and anti-government, but I would argue right now they're really just saying everything that honestly the GOP is saying. To me, it's just a far-right movement saying the same policies that everyone on the far right is pretty much advocating.
I think also when we think of, oh, he can't do that or they won't be able to do that, I think that there are things that they won't be able to do. There's always mistakes. There's all of that, of which we can't rely on as our main strategy. At least morally, I don't think we can. I also think that there are cases where this time around, they've made advances ahead of time that they couldn't dream of making last time. Your lifting up of the Laken Riley Act is an extreme example of that.
Unfortunately, I feel like the biggest problem is the lack of resistance from Democrats and liberals. Like when we saw Trump win, we saw Democrats and liberals opposing these policies, and now we see them passing them into law. To me, that's sort of the horrific part, is not seeing that for exactly what it is.
I think that that's an essential recognition. And I think that on the one hand, you have that lack of resistance, and then you have what I will call the fascist base, which is not limited to the militia movement, but does include the militia movement, which is all too eager to say, hey, you're having trouble? You don't have enough hands? I'll be one of those hands. I'll help. And we've seen what that has gotten before, which has gotten the deaths of migrants and asylum seekers. I think that disconnect where all the passion seems to be on the side of those who think it's favorable to hunt down, lock up, and throw out, oftentimes to their deaths, migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees. I think that situation definitely needs to change really quickly.
Yeah, and to add something about militias, you know what? One of the things that's sort of interesting about it is the role of some of these right-wing sheriffs in their cooperation with militias, even if it doesn't serve as a direct connection. Some people are like, oh, they'll hire the militias to do the work. It could happen. I actually think at some places they are unlikely to hire some of the militias, largely because they're extremely unreliable just as people, as humans. And also, to be clear, all these movements have dissenters and fighting within. So militia movement itself has fighting within the movement about what they should be doing. But what sheriffs do is, one, don't condemn them, and two, give them lots and lots of rope. While sometimes the relationship is a little bit like militias are courting the sheriffs and the sheriffs are like, sure, that's cool, but they're not courting the militias. Typically what I saw in reporting is militias court the sheriff, and the sheriff tends to be like, yeah, man, like whatever you want. So it's a little different than a sheriff being, I hire you, militia. But what that still generates is the perception of impunity. So for example, if you look at the rancher in Arizona who shot an immigrant crossing his ranch, who was, by the way, not convicted. He was acquitted of that crime. So you kind of create this impunity where something like vigilante violence, this Daniel Penny style violence is permitted, is condoned, and it's sort of like, well, it's all fine. They're working on the side of the good guys. Because the thing about it is that militias and then these sort of quasi-vigilantes believe that they're working with law enforcement. They believe in their hearts they are law enforcement and that what they are doing is correct and right. And the issue is that you cannot persuade people that what they are doing is not correct and right. They believe it in their gut. And the fact that we have, I think in this country, we sort of can't leave out the fact that both political parties have elevated law enforcement to the extent that they have many benefits that regular humans don't have. They have a lot more impunity than humans have. And what we see is that this impunity, this super citizen status, is getting cast off onto militias and vigilantes. This aura of I could do whatever I want is spreading to all the people who are purporting to call themselves a form of law enforcement. The issue with that is that more police is not going to fix that, because the problem is all those people think they are police. The country has made police. The police can operate with impunity. They do get to arrest and jail people. They do get to deport people. As a result, that impunity is just getting transferred onto other people. Again, mostly white men, not totally, but in the most cases, and that is creating an atmosphere that is, I can do what I want. And that includes other things. It's not just vigilante violence against immigrants or people of color, but also things like domestic violence, violence to their partners at home, resistance to doing anything about domestic violence. Right now, the leading cause of death for pregnant women is domestic violence. We know law enforcement, they have high numbers of people who perpetuate domestic violence. It's happening all over the place where we see this impunity sort of rubbing off. And that was just something I saw a lot, was that this idea that if I buy a gun, if I comport myself like law enforcement, if I look like law enforcement, then I have impunity because I'm fighting bad guys. And the bad guys then extends to not only perceived threats from without, which would be like immigrants, it's perceived threats from within, like a person on the subway or your partner at home. I just think it's this really dangerous situation that I would have to say both parties have elevated law enforcement to the extent that they can do this. And they have this sort of money and weaponry to do it.
Really, really important reminder. I was thinking about kind of the permission structure that you were getting at. I was thinking how in some ways I think it's now like going beyond that, where some of these too often, I think they're not just being allowed to do these things, but once they do them, no, they're not being like given a gun and told, shoot this person.
Right.
But once they do the act, that, let's be clear, has been fomented. And oftentimes these sheriffs going on Fox or wherever are giving that the thumbs up. Well, I'm not saying they're telling them to do these things again. I think that after they do them, they're then lionized.
They're feted. They're celebrated, like a Kyle Rittenhouse,
Yeah.
right? Exactly.
And I think that I don't see that stopping. I feel like when it comes to their ethnic cleansing through mass deportation plot, I hate being like, that's definitely going to happen. But I feel like that's something that I'm not a betting person, but if you were, I feel like that would be something to bet on and pretty much get a guarantee, because that has been the trajectory that we've been on. I was wondering, as we move towards the end of our discussion that I'm enjoying so much, I wanted to get your thoughts on other aspects of Agenda 47 that you think sheriffs could play in the immediate sense a big role in addition to mass deportation, which we have discussed.
I mean, a few of the other ones I've sort of been pointing, one of them is the policing of protests. So there's been a huge movement, and I'm sure many people are aware, particularly protests, like anti-genocide protests, being depicted as terrorist acts. Honestly, from my reporting, that is something sheriffs are actually specifically being told and trained to see, and that this, I think, will create more arrests for protests, as well as like a huge amount of connections between this idea of mass deportation, anxieties about terrorism, which has just been amplified by recent events, has reanimated the ISIS anxiety, and then that being connected to student protesters being viewed as pro-Hamas. And so it's generating, again, this sort of anti-Muslim anxiety, which is very old. And very old sheriffs have also been doing that, and militia. So this is sort of like an old right-wing thing that they're kind of reviving. And the other thing I've been watching is just basically access to abortion care. Sheriffs control jails, and so there's already a deep concern with pregnant people who are in jails and incarcerated and their access to any kind of care. But I do think because sheriffs have shown themselves rather Christian, and they have a sort of ability to use their religious faith as justification to do certain kinds of policing. And I've just seen it in particular when it comes to abortion. So for example, a kind of high-ranking sheriff deputy will say, in my religion, abortion is murder. And if I see someone procuring an abortion, I will charge them as a murderer. And it doesn't even require like a law. They're just, well, I feel like this is wrong, and therefore I will create a criminal. So you're creating, again, criminals out of people seeking abortion care because they feel like it's bad. And that is one of the things you're sort of like generating this creation of criminality. Now, again, aided and abetted by laws and a legal structure that is allowing it. But you can always count on sheriffs to like take it to the degree of creating criminals. And so that's something else I've been really watching, particularly if we start to talk about people traveling to get abortion care. That's a lot of sheriffs who control highways, pathways that people travel. That's something I have my eye on in terms of, I could see this as a big concern.
I want to thank you so much, Jessica, for taking the time to talk to me, for sharing with us your insights, your expertise, your perspective, and of course, your book. Jessica's book is linked in the show notes, so go get it, go read it, go talk to people about it. Besides getting your book and reading it, are there any other places that you want to connect listeners to? Any other work of yours that you want to lift up, or ways that they can read more from you, or anything that I didn't give you an opportunity to say?
I have a newsletter that's Posse Comitatus. It's just sheriffs.substack.com. I haven't been posting as regularly. I am on social media a lot, and it's just Jess Pish on Blue Sky. So if I try to post sheriff news there or in my newsletter if I can.
Wonderful. Well, we'll link to that too. Thanks so much. Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. Connect with us on the socials at Refuse Fascism and on YouTube at Refuse_Fascism. Help us confront Trump-backed fascism. Inauguration is tomorrow, and your support and involvement are critical as Refuse Fascism works to stir and mobilize the only force that can stop this nightmare, the tens of millions who hate everything Trump and MAGA represent. For as little as $2 a month, you can fuel the mass refusal we need by becoming a patron of Refuse Fascism. Join our community at patreon.com/refusefascism. If you're not in a position to give monthly but want to make a one-time gift, please visit refusefascism.org and hit the donate button. Thanks in advance for your support. And if you can't give now, share the show with others, rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Comment on our socials or YouTube. It makes a difference and is so appreciated. As always, thanks to Richie Marini, Lena Thorne, and Mark Tingelman for helping produce this episode. Thanks to incredible volunteers, we have transcripts available for each show, so be sure to visit refusefascism.org and sign up to get them in your inbox. We are headed towards some dark, scary times, but we have each other, and that means a lot. Until next Sunday, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.